Welcome to part 8 of our reproductive systems lecture. This is going to talk about the female reproductive systems, and it's going to match page 553 to 556, and then we're also going to talk about the mammary glands, which you can find on page 561. First, we're just going to introduce what all the structures are, and then we'll talk about each one individually in more detail. So just like we had the primary sex organs or gonads in the males, which were the testes, in the females they're the ovaries. And remember that the primary sex organs have two main roles. They produce the gametes, which are the cells that contain the genetic information of the parent and are going to be passed on. They also produce the primary sex hormones. So in the case of the females, the ovaries produce ovum, which is basically a fancy word for eggs, and then the female sex hormones. Then there's a duct system. So on this diagram, you can see here the ovaries, there's two. And then there's a duct system following out from it. And just like the duct system in the males, it leads to the exterior. However, the male duct system is designed for primarily letting things exit. This is primarily designed to receive things. So this consists of the fallopian tubes, which you can see here, the uterus, which you can see here, and the vagina, which you can see here. Then we'll talk about the external genitalia as well. We're also going to talk about mammary glands. And males and females have mammary glands, but they're only functional in females, which is why we're only talking about it in this lecture. Okay, so to start with the ovaries, if we could zoom in on one of those ovaries, this is what it would look like. And this is showing you the various stages of things that are going to go on. So this is not all going on at the same time. If you can imagine, sort of time lapse, starts here and then moves through each of these stages over the period of about a month, and we'll talk about that. So I'm sorry that this word is cut off, but what this says is that it contains ovarian follicles, and that word is right here, follicle. And follicles are basically a capsule of cells that are going to contain the egg. So it starts off containing the oocyte, which is fun to say. So this double O prefix refers to egg, and cyte refers to cell. So basically this is an immature egg cell, and then it's surrounded by a layer of cells that slowly will fill with more cells and fluid, as you can see happening here as it grows. Once that egg has matured, so it started off as an immature egg here, that follicle grows around it, it matures, and once it's mature and ready to go, that follicle surrounding it will rupture and it will be released, and that's called ovulation. Ovulation occurs roughly every 28 days. So this whole process of maturing, release, and then this breaking down, which we'll talk about in a second, and starting again, is basically a 1-month process. And that's why menstruation occurs roughly every month. And we'll talk about that more in a future lecture. But once that egg has been released, or the ovum has been released, this follicle is left over, and it's going to break down. It's going to become something called a corpus luteum, and then it's eventually going to degenerate and break back down. The follicle cells here, so these cells that are surrounding the egg, have another role besides protecting the immature egg. They produce estrogen, which is the primary sex hormone in females. And then the corpus luteum, after the egg's been released and that follicle is breaking down, releases another sex hormone for females called progesterone. And so this accounts for the differences in both characteristics physically and maybe emotionally that go on at different times throughout a female's cycle, because in this first half of the cycle, estrogen's being released. In the second half, it's more progesterone. Okay, so once the egg has been released, once ovulation has occurred, it enters the start of that duct system called the fallopian tubes. And your book and other places might also refer to it as the uterine tubes. They are the same thing. Okay, and the job of the fallopian tubes is first to receive that oocyte. So the little egg gets released, and the fallopian tube almost has to catch it. You can sort of see in this diagram, it's not continuous. There's an opening here, and then there's this finger-like projections for that egg to be caught and funneled into the fallopian tube. So there's no actual contact, and those finger-like catchers are called fimbriae. Okay, what this means is that not all the eggs that are released make it. Okay, so some eggs can get lost. They can go out into the space here and not actually make it into the fallopian tube. Okay, once the egg has entered the fallopian tube, there's a couple of things to help it move along. Again, this is going, twisting and turning and going sideways. This is not because of gravity, and unlike the sperm, these are not designed to swim on their own. So there's two things. There's little cilia, little hair that line the fallopian tube, and they'll beat and sort of create almost like oars moving in the water. They'll create a pulse, and that helps move the egg along. And then peristalsis, we're getting really used to seeing this. We've seen it now in the digestive and the urinary systems, is that sort of toothpaste-like muscular action that squeezes along. So those two things help keep the egg moving along. It's about a 3 to 4 day trip from the time that ovulation occurs for the egg to move through the length of the fallopian tubes. But here's an interesting thing. That egg is only viable for 24 hours after it's been ovulated. So here it gets ovulated. It's only got 24 hours, the first day of that 3 to 4 day trip, where it's viable, where it can continue to live. Okay, so as a result, the fallopian tube is actually where fertilization occurs. Where the sperm actually meets the egg is not in the uterus, it's in the fallopian tube. And you can see that here zoomed in. Right around this point is where that sperm will meet, if it's going to meet. If an egg doesn't meet a sperm while it's still viable, then no baby will occur. Okay, let's go back for a second. Once that egg has finished its 3 to 4 day trip, where it reaches is the uterus. And the uterus is located between the bladder and the rectum, so it's sort of in that pelvic area. And this is part of the reason that females who are pregnant have to go to the bathroom so frequently, is because their poor bladder is getting pushed out of the way to make room for that expanding uterus and the baby that's growing. Its job is to provide a home and nourishment for that developing embryo. It's designed to do two things. It's designed to increase in size, so as the embryo grows and the baby develops, it needs to expand and increase in size. And so it has a body, which is the sort of bulk of the uterus when it's at its smallest size. Then it has a fundus. It's the top part of the uterus, and it shows this in the diagram on your book at figure 16.8. Think about where we've seen the word fundus before. Okay, hopefully you're thinking about the stomach, that upper part of the stomach that was in charge of expanding when we eat that Chipotle burrito was the stretchy part. That's called the fundus. That's the same idea in the uterus. It's the top part, and it will expand upward as it needs to grow if there's a baby developing. And then the cervix is the exit. It's pretty narrow when the uterus is at its resting state. Another thing I want you to see about the design of the uterus is it has a 3-layered wall, and we've seen sort of similar layers to this before. The endometrium, which is the inner layer, it's a mucosa layer, so it's got lots and lots of blood vessels, lots of mucus. It's nice and warm and moist, and it's where the actual fertilized egg will implant if it's going to stay there and develop into a child. So it has quite a bit of nourishment there for that immature fertilized egg. Next is myometrium, and myo, as you know, means muscle. So this is a thick muscular layer, which again you can see in that diagram, and you can see it here. They've sort of taken a cross section out of this diagram of the uterus. So here is the endometrium that would be inside facing that fertilized egg. Then here's that layer of muscle, and that's going to become very important when the baby's actually born. We need pretty forceful contractions there to help the baby be born. And then lastly, the perimetrium is the outer covering layer, the protective layer. Okay, so let's go back. We have the ovaries that produce the egg and let it mature and then ovulate and release it. We have the fallopian tubes that catch the egg and then are the site of fertilization if it's going to occur. Okay, so either way the egg travels on. If it's fertilized, it will travel on and implant to start developing into an embryo and a baby. If not, it will just continue on and it will be expelled with the menstrual cycle. Okay, they come to the uterus, okay, where it's going to implant in the endometrium if it's going to develop, okay, and where it can stretch and grow because of the design of this with the fundus. And then it's going to exit through the vagina. So either the menstrual cycle exits through the vagina with the menstrual flow, everything that was there to be prepared for the baby to develop gets excreted because there is no baby to develop if fertilization doesn't occur, or fertilization did occur, the fertilized egg implanted, it stayed and developed in the uterus, and then when it's time for the baby to be born, it exits through the same exit. So the vagina is actually the tube that exits from the cervix, from the exit of the uterus to the exterior of the body. It's about 8 to 10 centimeters long. Sometimes you'll hear it called the birth canal. It has a couple of functions. One, it receives semen. And two, it's the exit for either the menstrual flow if there is no fertilization, or the baby after the baby is developed. And initially it's closed off by this thin layer of mucosa called the hymen. And this is a very thin layer, and it's very vascular, meaning it's got lots of blood supply. This typically is broken either the first time that someone has sex. It can also be broken, it's very thin, so it can be broken during sports activities when a tampon is put in. It doesn't just have to be during sex. All right, and then the external genitalia, also called the vulva, has several parts that we're going to talk about. First, the mons pubis is this layer of fatty tissue that's covering your pubic symphysis bone. Okay, remember that area where the two sides of the pelvis meet that actually just has a little cartilage between it? And we want protection in front of that. Next, the labia are the skin folds that surround the rest of the structures we're going to talk about. And there's two. There's the outer skin fold that has hair growth on it, and that's called the labia majora. And then there's the inner folds that do not have any skin on them, called the labia minora. And this is surrounding an area called the vestibule. So the entire area inside that is referred to as the vestibule. So if you hear that word, that's what we're talking about. Next is the clitoris. That's located right here, and this is sort of the counterpart to the penis in the male reproductive system. It doesn't have a reproductive role, but it does have the same sort of sensitive erectile tissue that when it becomes excited will become swollen with blood. All right, then there's two orifices. So if you remember back to our lecture on the male reproductive system, we said that both semen and urine pass through the same exit through that urethra. That's not the case for females. We have the bladder leading to the urethra, and that's where urine exits, and that's completely separate from the uterus that leads to the vaginal exit. So here you can see the urethral opening is right here. It's a very small opening, and it's more frontal than the vaginal opening, which is larger, more toward the posterior of the body. They're separate. So urine and menstrual system do not coincide. And then we have vestibular glands, and they are going to be to the side of the vaginal exits. There's two of them, and they secrete mucus for lubrication, usually during sex. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about as far as female reproductive structures are the mammary glands. And like I said at the beginning of this lecture, they're present in both sexes. They only function in the females, so we're really only going to talk about them with regards to females. They're basically modified sweat glands. So think way back to when we did the skin. We know that sweat glands are below the skin. They produce the sweat and they can secrete onto the surface. That's the same way that mammary glands are designed, but they're modified to produce milk instead of sweat. And they're stimulated by hormones. So the first time they're stimulated by hormones will be around puberty, where they increase inside the lobules and the glands grow. And the second time will be at the end of pregnancy. So toward the end of pregnancy, and then when the baby's born, the glands are stimulated to actually produce milk. We don't want to be producing this milk all the time unless there's actually a baby born to be fed. Okay, so the external structures that you'll actually see are the areola, which is sort of the more pigmented, tougher skin area that surrounds the nipple, and then the actual nipple, which is the exit for the milk. The internal structures are where the milk's actually being made and released. So there are alveolar glands, and they're sort of clustered in these lobes. So you can see here, and you can see it better in the more clear diagram in your book, that there's lobules here, and they're surrounded by connective tissue and adipose tissue for protection. But the alveolar glands are where the milk's being produced. And then there's lactiferous ducts, you can sort of see them here, that lead out, that carry the milk out when it's time for it to be secreted, lead out through the nipple. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to close that. So if you hear the word lactation, that is the scientific word for milk production. So when a woman is lactating, it means she's producing milk for her baby. So again, you'll find these types of glands. There are mammary glands in the breasts of males, but they're not going to be affected to grow or produce milk by hormones. That only happens in the females. They're only functional in the females. Okay, so that ends our lecture on the female reproductive system. We didn't really talk about exactly what happens during the menstrual cycle or exactly what's going to happen as that baby's developing. We will talk about that in a future lecture. Now that you know the structures of both the male and female, we'll talk about exactly how reproduction occurs.